to own them yourself, but bear means the right to carry them. And that's validated the New York law, but New York has decided they're going to do everything they can to get around this, and so we've got a couple of cases before the Supreme Court right now, the foundation. We filed briefs on both of these. One comes out of Chicago, and Chicago has some very strict laws about what guns you can own and what you can't. The Dr. Herrera is an emergency room physician, and he also serves on a SWAT team, and meaning he has to be familiar with the use of firearms and so on, because he may have to receive one from an injured officer. And
does that mean
basically the way the firearms laws work there, he can't even own the arms that he is required to be trained and provisioned in for the SWAT team.
All right,
so this is being challenged. At the same time, New York has decided in an emergency session that they're going to get around the Supreme Court decision, and they have a number of places where you're not allowed to own firearms or keep firearms at all. One of those is churches. We filed an amicus brief in support of those challenging this law too, and part of our argument on this one is that this is a matter of jurisdiction. It is none of the state's business whether the church wants its people to carry arms or not. And if a church takes the position that we don't want any firearms in our church, I probably wouldn't go to that church, but I would respect their right to take that position. Likewise, I respect their right to take the position that we need people in our church who can protect us if we are under attack. We tried to demonstrate in our brief there the historicity of having arms in church going back to the Pilgrims. And people right in front of us here were at a conference last summer in Plymouth Rock. I'm chairman of the board of the Plymouth Rock Foundation. By the way, how do you get to be chairman of the board of the Plymouth Rock Foundation? Well, simply, you get yourself talked into serving as vice chairman, because vice chairman won't involve any work, and then the chairman resigns. But anyway, you may recall possibly the most famous of all pilgrim painting, the pilgrims going to church. And it shows these pilgrims as they're going to church, carrying their firearms and protection both in front and in the back, and the account from the time, how they would stack their arms beside them in the church and the like, demonstrating that carrying arms and keeping arms in church is an American tradition. Anyway, we think the Supreme Court is probably going to strike that down. We still don't have a clear answer yet as far as what kind of a burden the state has to show in order to restrict religious liberty, including the right to attend church. And with the COVID issue, of course, as many of you know, a lot of churches all around the country were shut down. In Alabama, they shut ours down. My two little country churches never missed a Sunday. But at any rate, the question is, does the state only have to have what we call a rational basis, that is a very low level of protection and for the state interest in order to justify restrictions like that? Or do they have to have a much higher standard? Strict scrutiny is the term we use, demonstrating that there is a compelling interest that cannot be achieved by less restrictive means. It appears from several of the decisions that the Supreme Court made, two involving California, one involving New York, that they're going to hold the state to a very high standard of strict scrutiny before they allow the state to impose any kind of restrictions on people with religious liberty. And that's our hope. But there are cases going on before the court right now that will probably address that. Those are probably the two biggest issues I see right now.
Okay. We are actually live over live stream, so welcome you joining us back in that fashion. I think we'll go right to the questions that have been submitted here. First one I have on top says, how much protection should the president have for acts he commits while in office? Seems current.
That is slightly current, and I can speak with a little expertise on this because all the time I was on the plane from Atlanta to Boise yesterday, I had Fox News on, and they were carrying the trial live. I guess to answer the question, based on several previous cases, U.S. versus Nixon, Nixon versus Fitzgerald, several others like this, I would have to say that I think the likelihood what the court is going to say is somewhere down the middle. First of all, president couldn't do anything. His hands would be completely tied if anything he did was subject to being sued over. Secondly, so I think the court is going to rule that he has some degree of immunity, but probably not total immunity. I think they're also probably going to say that while the president is in office, he cannot be sued because that would just tie him down too much. And there was a similar decision in regard to Clinton. And much as I wanted to see Clinton get sued, I had to agree that you can't tie up a president like that with lawsuits all the time he's in office. So you probably say it has to be suspended while he's in office. So hopefully trials won't get resolved until January, and then after January they won't have any opportunity to do anything for at least 4 years. That's my hope. But that's my guess is the court's going to come down somewhere in between. Not total immunity, partial immunity.
Can you describe, like, what would be the dividing line? I mean, types of acts that would be falling outside and those that would stay under immunity?
Okay, the question, what kinds of dividing lines might there be as to what is and is not immune? Well, one way they might possibly do it is, we often have a standard that we use in law that, in tort law, for example, somebody can be sued if they're negligent. But for some things, they can be sued only if they're grossly negligent. And grossly negligent has to mean on purpose or with reckless and willful disregard of safety and other people's interests and rights and so on. They might say that the president could be sued not for ordinary negligence, but for gross negligence. For example, let's say, trying to illustrate the difference, let's say that you go through a stop sign and cause an accident. That would be negligence, probably not gross negligence. On the other hand, if you're going down Main Street 90 miles an hour with a 3.5 blood alcohol level and swerving back and forth and everything like that, that would be gross negligence. And you could possibly use the negligence versus gross negligence as being one basis for dividing. They might say anything that was a deliberate violation of law, that might be a standard they could use. They might also, and this is one of the things that we're talking about some yesterday, is distinguishing between things in which the president had a personal interest versus simply political decisions. For example, action concerning abortion, that would be a political decision. Action that might further his own personal interests, financially or maritally or even electorally, that might be personal. So those might be, if you possibly divided by it. The fact is, we don't know. The justices themselves are probably not going to agree.
So you expect definitely a split decision, but a granting of at least a partial opinion.
That's what I would say, but as far as a split decision, you recall the court did unanimously rule that President Trump was entitled to be on the ballot in Colorado, and they do try to come to unanimity. In fact, they probably decide more cases unanimously than they decide on split decisions. They like to try for that. The ones we hear about, of course, are the ones that are split. Those are the ones that make the news. Those are the ones that are controversial. But you can't always judge how a Supreme Court justice is going to vote on something like that just based on who appointed them or whether they're liberal or conservative, or even on the basis of the kinds of questions they ask. Questions that a justice may be asking in court may indicate he's leaning a certain way, or it may be that he has some lingering doubts that he'd like to rule in your favor on this case, but he has some lingering doubts about it, and he's asking you some rather hostile questions to get you to clear up his doubts. And one of the things we always tell law students is, you prepare an argument to present before the Supreme Court. Understand your argument is just filler material in case there's a period of silence. But your real purpose in being there is to answer the justice's questions. There was one case that I was told about where one young prosecutor was before the U.S. Supreme Court, had never been there before, and anyway, Justice Frankfurter interrupted him with a question. He said, now, Your Honor, I'm arguing. The Chief Justice said, Counselor, if Justice Frankfurter is asking you a question, you better answer. And he said, very well, state your question. He lost his case. But
okay. protocol, very important. The next two questions are somewhat similar. They talk about more in terms of, do you really feel we're in a constitutional crisis, or how would you define it? If you were asked, how does an issue reach the level of constitutional crisis? How would you explain or define that?
Are you asking how it gets to the Supreme Court?
Well, would you say that if something reaches the Supreme Court, it's a constitutional crisis? I guess I'm emphasizing the idea of crisis.
Yeah, well, somebody thinks it's important that they wouldn't be taking it up there, but whether the court considers it a constitutional crisis may be another question. So, fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court can hear cases. There are several types of cases that they have original jurisdiction, that is, you can file directly in the Supreme Court. The overwhelming majority, they have appellate jurisdiction, meaning that they hear a case on appeal, either from one of the circuit courts of appeals or from one of the state Supreme Courts. And these cases, when they go to the Supreme Court, 99% of them get turned down. And when they turn down a case, they're not necessarily they agree with the way it was decided. Rather, they're saying, we've getting over 10,000 cases each year before us. We can only hear about 100 or less, or fewer, pardon me. And so this is just not one of the 100 that we're going to select. That may be because there were problems in the way the case was presented at the lower level. It might be because this is a case involving free exercise of religion. We've already got three exercise cases that we're hearing this term already, and we've got other subjects we need to consider. It might be there are some facts here that are not in your favor, and if we were to accept this case, we would be deciding in a way that set a precedent that you wouldn't like, so we're doing you a favor by not hearing your case. But what can you do to make your case be one of the 1% that get heard? Well, a couple of things. One, you need to demonstrate that it affects a lot more people than just the parties here. For example, some of us here are old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson murder trial. It was called the case of the century, remember? But it never got to the Supreme Court. Because obviously it was sensational, there were a lot of news headlines, daily coverage, but it didn't really have any issues that affected anybody beyond the parties to the case itself. You need to demonstrate that this is a case that involves constitutional issues or other legal issues that affect not just these people, but affect the nation as a whole. For example, we had a case involving prayer at football games. I would argue this doesn't just affect this high school. There are thousands of high schools all over the country that are wondering the same question and are looking to this court for guidance. Another thing you can do to get the case to be more likely heard by the court is to demonstrate that the issue has come up in a number of places and the lower courts are split. That, again, prayer and football games, the Ninth Circuit, California, decided that it's unconstitutional. The Fifth Circuit in Texas ruled that it's constitutional. The North Dakota Supreme Court ruled that it's constitutional. The New York Supreme Court ruled that it isn't. In other words, the lower courts are split on this, and since it's a constitutional issue, we need a uniform rule, and that's why you, justices, need to step in. Those are some of the things you can do to make it a more likely to be taken, and I guess that would mean it rises to the level of a constitutional crisis then.
Okay. By the way, if you do have other questions, if you just hold your card up, I do have some runners that can grab it and bring it over, and we'll try to get to it. What are your thoughts on the changes to Title IX under the Biden administration?
To be honest, I need to know a little more about those changes. I haven't kept up on that. Do you explain that more fully?
I don't know for sure, but it may relate to allowing biological males participating in female sports.
Okay, you're probably talking there in regard to the Bostock case. If the person who asked the question wants to clarify that.
Does anybody want, I don't know who wrote the question, if you have specifics.
It was me. So there are several cases that have come out, and I imagine we'll see more. But recently, and very recently, the Biden administration made changes to Title IX on a grand scale, where they changed significant things, including allowing biological males who are transgender in women's spaces, and also changing some issues with like how sexual misconduct is handled on university grounds. So I know it's an issue that's been kind of building over time, and I imagine it might become a constitutional issue at some point. I'm curious what that, maybe, your thoughts on just kind of that topic in general.
Okay, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race or sex or religion and several other categories. And the question is, when it says you can't have sex discrimination, does this just mean that you can't refuse to hire somebody because she is a woman or because she is a man, or does it include sexual preference or sexual identification? And we had a case out of Georgia, the Bostock case, where the Supreme Court, and I'm still trying to figure out what Justice Gorsuch was thinking on this, because for the most part, Justice Gorsuch has been a very good justice, but he ruled that because, well, invalidate a homosexual who had been fired not just because he was homosexual, because he made some sexual advances, but anyway, the court in that case simply, Justice Gorsuch said that this whole thing obviously pertains to sex. And so even though it's not a matter of being fired because he's male or fired because somebody else is female, it obviously was sex related, and therefore it is prohibited by the Civil Rights Act of '64. We had filed a brief in that case. We had argued in that case that this definitely was not what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended in 1868, nor was it what the authors of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 intended. That anybody on the floor of Congress had ever argued in 1964 that if we pass this, this is going to include protection for homosexuals and so on, the bill would have been laughed out of it. This clearly is not what it means. But what we're talking about now is not so much changes to the statute itself, Title IX. We're talking about regulations that the Biden administration is opposed to. I don't think at this point they could probably get Title IX changed by Congress, but the Biden administration can enact regulations anytime they want to. For one thing, we had a school district in Iowa, Linmar, that's Cedar Rapids, which is kind of a liberal outpost in a pretty conservative state. But anyway, they're requiring that all students and faculty must address teachers and other students by their preferred pronouns. And your parents have challenged this. Federal judge upheld the policy. The 8th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed and ruled that the parents were right and their children could not be forced to do this. But anyway, that apparently is being made into a general policy nationwide by the Biden administration. And the state of Tennessee is challenging it, arguing that it violates states' rights and the rights of individual parents and students and teachers. And we'll see what they do on that, but I guess my own perspective on that is that a person has a right to call himself anything he wants, but he doesn't have a right to force other people to call it that, especially if it violates their religious convictions or moral convictions or even perception of truth to do so. And I'm still trying to get them to recognize my preferred pronouns. My preferred pronouns are thee, thou, thy, and thine. But being from Alabama, I'd settle for y'all. This doesn't seem to be what they have in mind.
We probably only have 5-10 minutes max, so concise answers. And then if you don't get a full enough answer to your question, you can discuss things with John. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions here. We'll try to reach this, if possible, get through that. This one says, recent Palestine protests across America. What should America be focused on with world conflicts? Should we stay out?
Concise answer, yes.
To the very last question.
Can you expand on that?
Minor
I guess to answer the question, those who want to protest against United States policy have a right to do so. But campuses that deliberately make things uncomfortable for people of Jewish ancestry and so on, that's a different matter. I think the main thing with schools like Harvard and so on, the good thing going on there is the president has had to resign. Their endowment fund is being dwindled a great deal. Enrollments are down, and sometimes the marketplace is the best thing to address this. But as far as the Palestinian issue in general is concerned, I think our position needs to be that doesn't mean that Israel can do no wrong. The prophets certainly criticized Israel many times. But it does mean that God has said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And not only do we want to be on the right side of history in regard to Israel, but they are the best ally we have, and we need to stand behind them. But anyway, but as far as the protests, I recognize they have a right to protest, but I feel in other ways that the administrations have shown a great deal of favoritism toward them, and that is clearly wrong. That was concise.
Romans 13:1-7 is clear about our duty to be subject to the powers that be. However, in our U.S. Constitution, the citizenry is given a great deal of power, if not the highest. Therefore, how ought we as Christians and U.S. citizens respond to government overreach or tyranny? They needed to be at your meeting last night.
We did talk about that last night. One of the things I suggested last night is when we looked at the way we're defeating the federal bureaucracy, it's through the 16th Amendment and the income tax. And we pay taxes on April 15th, which is just 6 months after the elections and 6 months before the next elections, we will forget about income tax again. I suggest that we have tax day be the day before election day. But specifically, in regard to fighting against big government and so on, we need to use the legal means when possible. But there is a right of disobedience when government commands what the Word of God forbids, or forbids what the Word of God commands. And there's also the duty of lesser magistrates to interpose. And looking at Romans 13, well, Paul says that the civil ruler, and he's referring particularly there to citizens living in the city of Rome, Christians in the city of Rome, at a time about 60 AD when the emperor is Nero. And Nero was almost as bad as Biden. But
Almost.
But the point is, he still says to obey. However, he says that the civil ruler rewards what is right and punishes what is wrong. And God has given him authority to do that. He does not address the question of what we are to do when government rewards wrong and punishes good. And in that situation, we need to do what we read in Acts 5:29 when the disciples say, we ought to obey God rather than men. Or the Hebrew midwives of Exodus 1 that feared God and did not as Pharaoh commanded them. Or Daniel and his friends when they disobeyed.
Do you see any encouraging trends in biblical Christian education in America? I ask because the success of our form of government relies so much upon education.
Do I see any good trends in education? Frankly, in public education, I see none. There are good people there, good teachers there, Christian teachers there, patriot teachers there, and students as well. But as far as anything moving in the right direction in public education, the only thing that I see moving in the right direction there is declining enrollment. And I'd be happy and proud to have my wife teach in the public schools. I would not send my children to them. But I do see encouraging things, good things going on in Christian education, classical conversations. Seems to be a very good program. My grandchildren are involved in that. My series, Historical and Theological Foundations of Law, is being picked up by the Foundation for American Christian Education, and I'm glad to see that. So those are good trends. But the increase in home education, I recall my first homeschool case was back in the 1970s, and at that time it seemed almost unheard of, but I remember Paul Lindstrom of Christian Liberty Academy being in my home as he was going to be an expert witness for me in a case involving one of his family students. And I remember Paul Lindstrom telling me that the day was going to come when home education was going to be just as acceptable as any other form. And I thought, well, you're kind of a dreamer, but 40 plus years later, I would say he was absolutely correct. And the teach at home, which was not the same thing as home education during COVID, led a lot of people to see curriculum and see what was going on in public schools and to see the need to take their children out. And when they were being forced to have home education of a sort there, then they decided we need to continue this on a real basis. So home education had a great boost as a result of COVID, and I'm certainly glad to see that. Maybe one good thing is I'm seeing more and more families and parents standing up against what's going on in public education and in libraries. Eagle Forum has done a good job in this area. Moms for Liberty is doing a lot lately, and I'm seeing them doing some very good things in this area. Standing up in library meetings, board meetings, and school board meetings, and I love the tactic they use sometimes of taking these textbooks and reading out of them in front of the audience, being told by the chairman of the meeting, you can't read that here, and say, okay, but you're letting our children read these in the library or in school, but you're saying we can't read them to adults here. They made their point.
Okay, we got two others here, excuse me, real quick, and I did not, well, let's see what you think of this. What happened in 1871 under President Grant? And in parentheses, corporation agreement with Bankers of England?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. That's concise.
Okay, so maybe the individual asked that can individually to give more details and get a response. Quick definitions here. Can you explain common law, maritime law, and constitutional law?
Common law, I do have a section in volume 2 of Historical Theological Foundations that gives you a definition of common law, partly based on the definitions Herb Titus has given, partly based on, I think of the author right now, but his work, The Excellence of the Common Law. But common law, you might say, is a tradition that developed, some will say it began to develop shortly after the Norman Conquest. I would say it was well in place in the Anglo-Saxon common law before that. But it's unwritten principles that are just based on usage, based on custom, sometimes based on precedent. But all of this, plus edicts of kings and so on, developing into just kind of a body of legal principles that kind of operates as an unwritten constitution. And that would be a pretty good definition of common law. I've got several other definitions in the book that I can't quote to you right now, but I can show them to you. But anyway, that'd be basically my definition. Unwritten principles that nevertheless bind our courts.
Maritime law?
Maritime law is a unique form of statutory law that was originally intended for international law, dealing with different countries and with naval forces as well. But as far as an attempt now, there's quite an attempt to take maritime law and make that into statutory law for the nation itself. And I see that as being dangerous. Constitutional law, then, the definition of constitutional law are the principles found in the United States Constitution, and as they are explained by the courts. But I would emphasize that any court decision that is contrary to the plain wording of the Constitution is not a valid decision.
Okay, why don't we give John a hand here? He answered all the questions. We are going to take a break of approximately 15-20 minutes, and we need to get our contraptions set up upstairs so that John can be viewed live stream and get recorded. But approximately 1:30, he will be speaking on the founding fathers, Christians or deists. And I'm going to be speaking, it says fellowship hall, but I've actually set myself up in the classroom just right out on the hallway here. So we didn't have to do things in here. And I will be speaking on biblical principles of the preamble. And so you know, we're given about an hour, so when we get started, John, you'll just be starting yourself. I won't be able to be up there to introduce you, but most everybody's met you now. And so you're free to choose either place to go, and about 1:30 or so we'll get started with those.